We know that in this broken world, um, the foul stench of decomposition wafts through the valley of the shadow of death. And yet, nevertheless, we are maybe naive enough to believe that this is a surprising thing and a shocking thing when the world resists us. Maybe someone that we trusted says a word of betrayal. Maybe someone that we were vulnerable with uses that information against us. Maybe we become isolated for our faith. Maybe maybe this broken world seems like it is constantly working against you and defying the work of God in your life. And I think we all get to this point at times where we just feel like everything is working against us. Everything is pushing against the people of God. And we need to know, how do we fight back? How do we defeat this defiance that this fallen world offers against God? And that question was something that was very prevalent in a long time ago, in the time of King Saul, the time of King Saul. And so today I would like to talk about one of probably the best known Bible stories in the whole world, the Bible story of David and Goliath. And unfortunately, we're not going to read through it verse by verse. I'm going to tell the story and pick out important verses. If you'd like to follow along, maybe pay attention as closely as you can. We'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 17. That's 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I want to show you, as we begin our time this morning, I want to show you how God works to defeat the defiance of the world, okay? And so this story began maybe on a foggy morning on the hills of Soko. And this hills of Soko are in the western marches of the Judean countryside. And on either side of these two hills, there are these two armies that amassed. On the one hand was the armies of the people of God. It was the armies that were amassed under King Saul. And on the other, there was the armies that were amassed of the Philistines. And these two forces were gearing up for war. Now, what's important about this is that the Philistines were not merely raiding. This wasn't merely a raiding party, but that these Philistines were pushing back against the ongoing settlement of the Israelites' promised land. See, what in essence was happening was that the Philistines were not they were not just trying to take advantage of Israel, but that they were trying to hinder Israel from fulfilling her God-given mission. The Philistines were not just defying the people of God; the Philistines were defying the God of Israel. You see, this is not This is not a war. This is not a conflict over petty territory. No, this is not some kind of border conflict. This is the forces of the world amassing themselves to stop the advancement of the people of God, to stop the advancement of God's mission on earth. And what is so important about this army that has massed itself against the people of God is not its massive size, it's the man that comes out as their champion. Now, representative combat was at least familiar to everyone who would have been at this battle. And their representative, their champion, was a man named Goliath. Now, Goliath was probably about 9 feet tall, and in his hand he carried, well, are those saplings? Are those trees? No, those are his weapons. Those are his spears. He is so massive that his weapons look like he is hurling trees at people. He is a terrifying force of nature, and he comes out and he lays out some standard rules of combat. And basically, what he says to Israel is send a man to fight me, and if he wins, then we will all be your servants. But if I win, then you will all be my servants. And those are fairly simple rules of combat, but we all know that there's a message beneath the message. There's something that Goliath is saying between the lines. And this is what he says, chapter 17, verse 10. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. You see, this fallen world will always defy the people of God, and Goliath himself is no exception. Goliath is no exception. And so what we see here is that there's this the fallen world is trying to defy the advancement of God's mission on earth. And what we see here is that the people of God seem helpless before this giant champion, Goliath. And there's an important lesson for us to learn. Because when the trials of this world feel like they are too heavy, and they will feel like they are too heavy, when the torments and the tribulations of this time feel like they're too much for us, God does not just want us to buckle down. God does not just want us to steel our resolve. No, God wants us to reach out for help from Him. God wants us to come to an end of our own strength so that we're willing to accept His resolution. And the resolution that God gives, the solution that God has for these situations, is so unlikely that the only person who might get glory out of it, the only person who might be deemed responsible for it, is none other than God Himself. Now, not far away from these misty hills, there was a father, a man named Jesse. And Jesse was worried. He hadn't heard back from his three oldest sons who were in the battle. And so Jesse decided that he was going to send some provisions to these three sons. And so he gets his youngest son, a man named David, and he sends some snacks and some provisions along with David to his brothers. In addition, he did send a little bit of a treat for the commander to try to honor the commander. Very, very interesting. I won't get into that. Now, while Jesse is sending his son, I don't think it is too unlikely that the prophecy that had just been made not long ago by this ailing prophet Samuel must have been going through his mind. And as he's watching his young son walk off into the distance, maybe he was thinking, that son, that young child of mine, this shepherd boy that I've raised, he might one day be a king. Could the word of God prove itself true? Probably shook his head and just smiled in ignorance. And so David shows up. David arrives onto the battlefield, and he gets to where his brothers' tents are, and so he kind of drops off the provisions with his brothers, and then David runs off. David is never one, by the way, to back away from a fight. David is not a coward, and he sees the battle line. He runs up to the battle line, and he gets there just as Goliath is coming out to do his spiel. And all Israel is they're quaking and they're listening. And David perks up his ears and he listens to what Goliath is saying. And it infuriates David. David is furious that the people of Israel are so cowardly. And so David goes throughout the lines of Israel and he is encouraging them and stirring them up and trying to put some strength in their bones, some fire in their feet. And he says this in verse 26. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And David is furious that the people of Israel have not stopped the babbling of this blasphemous fool. And while he's talking like this, David's oldest brother Eliab hears David. And he becomes angry. It infuriates him. And now what's interesting is that Eliab was one of the three brothers specifically mentioned just the last chapter when Samuel had come and anointed David. And God had specifically passed over Eliab to give the crown to his youngest brother, David. And like his father, Eliab probably remembered this event. It probably made him furious and insecure. And God had specifically said about Eliab that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Eliab probably shook that off, didn't pay much attention to it. But he hears David say these words. And he's frustrated that David would presume to try to stir up the people of God. And so Eliab pulls David aside. And Eliab, who is responsible for his family's honor, says this: I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Now, what's interesting here is that Eliab, who was responsible to make sure that his family's honor was kept intact in this situation, Eliab defends cowardice. And to a lesser degree than Goliath, Eliab himself is seeking to hinder the Lord's anointed. It's a different shade, a different species, but Eliab's defiance of God is present in this passage too. He presumes, he hypocritically tells David that there's presumption in David's heart, and yet he presumes to know what only God can know. He presumes to discern the hearts of men. But David is not the only, or Eliab is not the only one that hears David's words. These words also get back to King Saul. And now what's interesting is what King Saul had done when he heard the words of Goliath. King Saul, verse 11, tells us that King Saul was dismayed and greatly afraid. And so King Saul calls David to his tent, and he tries to dissuade David. He tries to keep David from going. He tries to keep David from this foolhardy challenge of Goliath. But David won't give in. And then what Saul does next is very interesting. It's very sly. He tries to put his armor on David. Now we got to ask, why does Saul want to do this? Is Saul trying to protect David? Is Saul trying to show compassion for David? Is Saul trying to endorse David? I don't think actually any of those. You see, Saul is a relatively shrewd guy, and he knows that in this situation, that really it should be him who's out there fighting Goliath. And so what does Saul do? Saul puts his armor on David to patronize him. Saul wants to become David's patron. See, if David wins the battle, which is very unlikely, wearing Saul's armor, who gets the glory? Well, Saul gets to share in some of that glory. But if David loses the battle wearing Saul's armor, Saul still gets some honor. Saul still gets some glory because he had patronized this young man. You see, what Saul does here, Saul sees a sinking ship, and he tries to make the best out of a bad situation. But David refuses to wear the armor of Saul, and he takes it off. He takes it off. And all along we see that God is he's raising up a champion to fight for his people. It's very interesting. This is a champion which, as Eliab and Saul have shown us, the world just does not understand. I mean, here he is, a young shepherd's boy who doesn't want to wear armor, who's willing to subvert the family order and the order of subject and king for the honor and the glory of God. Here we have a young man named David, who is willing to do what needs to be done, even though it seems foolhardy and foolish. The world does not understand this kind of champion. David is the lowest of low people. Later in 1st and 2nd Samuel, we'll find out that David is a very poor man. And here we see David is the lowest rung in his family. And David is also one of the lowest rungs in society. He is a shepherd boy who just doesn't have a lot of honor. He's accrued for himself yet. And so, but David is willing to subvert these things all so that God will get the glory. Very, very interesting. The world does not understand this kind of wisdom. This is why in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul says that the wisdom of God is, the folly of God, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. And that the wisdom of God seems like foolishness to us. And God works in these ways that are unlikely so that he gets the glory and no one else does. We can not be this kind of champion either, by the way. Have you noticed that? See, we are, at our core, many of us are like Eliab. Now, many of us are so like Eliab that we presume to know what only God can know. Many of us, we're like Saul. When the world defies the mission of God, we do not push back in the Lord's strength, but we tremble and quake in the corner. We cannot be the kind of champion that we need. But praise be that the Lord has risen up a champion for us. See, more unlikely of a champion, more profound of a champion, more important of a champion than David is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the champion that we all need. And Jesus Christ was risen from a lowly estate. He was born in a manger, born to a carpenter, at exile. He was a common man. There was nothing about his outward appearance, and yet it was through this that God would work his eternal victory. And so David comes before Goliath, and he stands before Goliath, and Goliath laughs when he sees him. He said, am I some kind of dog that you should send out a child to beat me with a stick? And Goliath says, I am going to feed you to the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. And yet what we see here is just in very short, concise details, the description of the victory of David. This is how David wins the victory. Verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. David prevails over Goliath. David prevails over Goliath. Two things that are very interesting. Two of the things that are noted about Goliath is the speeches that Goliath makes throughout this chapter, and in particular the speech that Goliath makes here against David. He says, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." But David responds to Goliath, and David turns Goliath's word back on itself, and he intensifies it. He says, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the world earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. You see, what is so fundamentally different between Goliath and between David is David is returning Goliath's word back on itself, and he's not taking the credit for himself. He's taking the credit for God. He's saying, listen, God is going to work a victory here. God is going to do something so amazing here, Goliath. David uses the same words that Goliath uses on Goliath. The second thing that's interesting, and one of the things that were noted in this chapter, is the massive size of Goliath's weapons. The massive size of Goliath's sword. And what's very interesting is that David goes up and David cuts off the head of Goliath with his own sword. That David uses Goliath's own sword to cut off his head. And now let me tell you why that is interesting, because that is a very shameful and dishonorable thing for Goliath to undergo. But in a very similar way, our champion, Jesus Christ, has defeated death with its own weapons. He has turned death back on itself. He has submitted sin to its own slavery. He has taken all the powers of the world, all the powers of the grave, all the chains of necromancy, and he has buried it under the ground. You see, God has, in the person of Christ, put death to death. He has put slavery to slavery. Here's what we need to understand about this passage. That God exalts the lowly over the proud despite lowliness itself. God exalts the lowly over the proud despite his lowliness. God exalts the lowly. He exalts the humble one. He exalts the meek one. He exalts Jesus Christ over the proud, over the arrogant, over the impudent, despite his lowliness, despite his meekness, despite his humility. God exalts the lowly over the proud despite his lowliness. And now here's what is very interesting about this whole idea of representative combat, this idea of champion. Because when David defeated Goliath, when he defeated the one who's defying Israel and defying the God of Israel, David did not just win the victory for himself, but all who were with him shared in the victory that he had. And so because David defeated Goliath, so the armies of Israel also defeated the armies of the Philistines. You see that there's this idea of representative combat, that the person who, the champion, will determine the fate of the many. And in a very similar way, we share in the victory that Christ has accomplished for us. You see, if you can relate to anyone in the story, it's not David that you relate to. And so often, I think when we tell this story, when we retell this story, the way that we retell it is you need to find those obstacles and overcome them. But you are not David in this story, okay? You are the armies of Israel. You are someone who needs a champion. You are someone who needs God to work salvation. And so often when we retell this story, we tell this story. We tell this story like we're telling people that they need to um, just kind of find a way to have victory. Listen, here's the important thing about this: God does not help those who help themselves. God does not give victory to those who reach out and grab victory. Okay, God helps those who cannot help themselves. God helps those who are fundamentally helpless. God helps those who cannot secure victory for themselves. Listen, in the same way that Israel prevailed that day because David prevailed, so we prevail over death and over sin. We prevail over the defiance of the world, the persecutions that we endure, the betrayals that we suffer, the hurts that we bear, because Christ has prevailed. So here is my application for you this morning, that you need to cultivate a trust in the victory that Christ has secured for you. You need to cultivate a trust in the victory that Christ has secured for you. And now, I'm not saying that as if I'm some kind of mystic. No, I think there are habits that you can have that will help you cultivate this trust. And so, one of the things that I would always say, and what I always encourage people to realize, is that there is no better way to cultivate trust, no better way to cultivate trust than by reading the kinds of the stories in the Bible where God accomplishes salvation for people. You can cultivate trust in God better and better and better just by learning about the ways that God brings salvation, the ways that God saves people, the ways that God has worked on behalf of people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Joshua and Joseph and Elijah and Elisha. Listen, the way that you cultivate trust in God is by learning about how God saves people, learning about God's righteousness, and learning that if God was trustworthy for them and faithful for them, God can be trustworthy and faithful for us. You and I can learn about this victory that's being accomplished for us on behalf of us by Christ, and by learning to trust and in cultivating a disposition of faith in God. God exalts the lowly over the proud despite his lowliness. God exalts the lowly. He exalts the humble. He exalts the meek. He exalts Jesus Christ over the proud, the arrogant, the boastful, the impudent, despite his lowliness, despite his meekness, despite his humiliation. A very interesting story. Can you imagine what it would have been like for an Israelite who was standing in this battlefield, who saw the victory that David had won on his behalf, and who did not rush forward to seize what had been gotten for him? So many of us today do not trust the victory that was won for us on the cross. And we watch all those around us rush on to victory, and we wonder, why have we been left behind? The key to living a victorious Christian life, to living a life that rests on the promises of God, is by cultivating this trust. And just like the battle that David won over the Philistines here was complete, David had nothing left to prove after this. Very interesting. After this story, David is going to show honor to all of his enemies in one way or another. He's going to show honor to Eliab. He's going to show honor to Saul. He's even going to show honor to the Philistines later in 1 Samuel. David has nothing left to prove. Victory has come. In the same way, we have nothing left to prove. We don't need to defend ourselves against the defiance of the world. We don't need to backstab others in return. We can trust in the victory that Christ has already purchased for us. Would you pray with me?